What happens when one of the most powerful legal battles in American political history takes a dramatic turn that nobody saw coming? Can a single appeals court decision completely reshape the legal landscape surrounding a former president's business empire? Is it possible that what appeared to be an ironclad victory for New York's Attorney General has just crumbled before our eyes? What if I told you that the massive financial penalty that was supposed to cripple the Trump Organization, a penalty that made headlines around the world, has just been thrown out by New York's appeals court? What does this mean for the ongoing legal battles? What does it mean for the 2024 election? And most importantly, what does it tell us about the American justice system when high-profile political cases collide with established legal precedent? Today, we're diving deep into the most significant legal development in the Trump Organization civil case, a development that has sent shockwaves through the legal community and political establishment. We're talking about Attorney General Letitia James's civil fraud case, the massive monetary penalty that was just overturned, and the remaining punishments that could still reshape how business is conducted in New York State. This isn't just about Donald Trump. This is about the boundaries of prosecutorial power, the role of appeals courts in checking government overreach, and what happens when civil enforcement meets constitutional protections. By the end of this analysis, you'll understand not just what happened, but why it matters for every American who cares about due process, business freedom, and the rule of law. To understand the significance of this appeals court victory, we need to go back to the beginning. New York Attorney General Letitia James brought a civil fraud case against the Trump Organization. Donald Trump and his two eldest sons, Donald Jr. and Eric Trump. This wasn't a criminal case. It was a civil enforcement action under New York's Executive Law Section 63(12), which gives the Attorney General broad powers to investigate and prosecute business fraud. The case centered around allegations that the Trump Organization systematically inflated the value of its assets when applying for loans and insurance, while simultaneously deflating those same asset values for tax purposes. Attorney General James argued that this constituted persistent fraud that warranted severe civil penalties. The specific allegations were detailed and far-reaching. The Attorney General's office claimed that Trump's financial statements overstated his net worth by billions of dollars between 2011 and 2021. They pointed to properties like Trump Tower, Mar-a-Lago, and various golf courses, alleging that their stated values in financial documents were wildly inconsistent with their actual market values. For example, the case alleged that Mar-a-Lago was valued at over $700 million in financial statements, while the Palm Beach County assessor valued it at approximately $18 to $25 million. The Trump Tower penthouse was allegedly valued at $327 million based on its size being listed as 30,000 square feet when it was actually 10,996 square feet. The Attorney General argued that these allegedly inflated valuations allowed the Trump Organization to secure more favorable loan terms and insurance coverage, giving them an unfair advantage over competitors and potentially defrauding financial institutions. Judge Arthur Engoron, who presided over the case, found in favor of the Attorney General on multiple counts. The original ruling was sweeping and severe, imposing what many legal experts called unprecedented penalties for a civil business fraud case. The judge ordered the Trump Organization to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties. Some reports put the total figure at over $450 million when including interest and other costs. But the monetary penalty was just the beginning. The original ruling by Judge Engoron went far beyond financial penalties. In what many legal observers called an extraordinarily broad use of judicial power, the court imposed operational restrictions that effectively sought to reshape how the Trump Organization could conduct business in New York State. The most controversial aspect was the multi-year ban preventing Donald Trump and his two eldest sons from holding corporate leadership positions in any New York corporation. This wasn't just about the Trump Organization. The ban would have prevented them from serving as officers or directors of any company incorporated in New York State. Additionally, the court appointed an independent monitor to oversee the Trump Organization's operations, giving a court-appointed official unprecedented access to internal business decisions, financial planning, and strategic operations of a private company. The ruling also included restrictions on the company's ability to obtain loans from New York financial institutions, potentially crippling its ability to conduct normal business operations in one of the world's major financial centers. Legal experts were divided on these penalties from the moment they were announced. Supporters argued that the scope of the alleged fraud warranted extraordinary remedies to protect the integrity of New York's financial markets. They pointed to the Attorney General's authority under Executive Law Section 63(12) and argued that the penalties were necessary to deter similar conduct by other businesses. Critics, however, argued that the penalties were grossly disproportionate to the alleged harm. They pointed out that none of the banks that provided loans to the Trump Organization claimed to have been defrauded, and that many of the loans had been repaid in full with interest. Some legal scholars questioned whether civil penalties could be used to impose what amounted to criminal punishment without the protections afforded in criminal proceedings. The business community watched these developments with growing concern. If these penalties could be imposed on the Trump Organization, what protections did other businesses have against similar prosecutorial actions? Were the penalties based on established legal precedent, or were they an unprecedented expansion of civil enforcement power? The Trump Organization's legal team immediately announced their intention to appeal the decision, arguing that the penalties were not only excessive but legally unsupported. Their appeal focused on several key constitutional and procedural arguments that would prove prescient. First, they argued that the penalties violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on excessive fines. The legal standard for determining whether a fine is excessive involves examining the relationship between the penalty and the harm caused, the defendant's ability to pay, and whether the fine serves legitimate remedial rather than punitive purposes. The defense argued that since no financial institution claimed to have been harmed by the alleged fraud, and since all loans had been repaid with interest, the massive monetary penalty bore no reasonable relationship to any actual damages. They contended that the penalty was punitive rather than remedial, making it inappropriate for civil enforcement. Second, the appeal challenged the operational restrictions as an unconstitutional deprivation of property and due process rights. The argument was that preventing individuals from engaging in lawful business activities based on civil findings, rather than criminal convictions, violated fundamental constitutional protections. The defense team also argued that the Attorney General's use of Executive Law Section 63(12) exceeded the statute's intended scope. While the law gives the Attorney General broad powers to combat fraud, the defense argued that it was never intended to impose criminal-like penalties in civil proceedings. Additionally, they challenged the appointment of an independent monitor as an inappropriate intrusion into private business operations. They argued that court-appointed monitors should be reserved for cases involving ongoing harm or clear evidence of continued misconduct, neither of which they claimed was present in this case. The appeals process moved through New York's court system with unprecedented public attention. Every filing was scrutinized by legal experts, political commentators, and business leaders trying to understand the broader implications of the case. The New York Appeals Court decision came as a shock to many observers who expected the original ruling to be upheld, perhaps with minor modifications. Instead, the appeals court delivered what can only be described as a devastating critique of the lower court's decision, throwing out the massive monetary penalty entirely. The appeals court's reasoning focused on several critical legal principles that the original court allegedly overlooked. First, they examined the question of harm, or more specifically, the lack of harm to any identifiable victims. The appeals court noted that none of the financial institutions that provided loans to the Trump Organization claimed to have been defrauded or damaged. In fact, many of these institutions had conducted their own due diligence, relied on their own appraisals and valuations, and had been repaid in full with interest. The court questioned how massive civil penalties could be justified when the alleged victims not only didn't claim harm but had actually profited from their business relationships with the Trump Organization. This aspect of the decision highlighted a fundamental principle of civil law. Penalties should be related to actual damages or the prevention of future harm. When neither element is clearly present, courts have traditionally been reluctant to impose severe sanctions. The appeals court also examined the constitutional issues raised by the defense, particularly the Eighth Amendment challenge. They found that the monetary penalty was grossly disproportionate to any harm that could be identified, making it constitutionally excessive under established precedent. The decision included sharp criticism of what the appeals court characterized as the lower court's expansion of prosecutorial power beyond established legal boundaries. They noted that civil enforcement actions, while important for maintaining market integrity, cannot be used to impose criminal-like punishments without the procedural protections that accompany criminal proceedings. Perhaps most significantly, the appeals court questioned whether the Attorney General's use of Executive Law Section 63(12) was appropriate in this case. While acknowledging the statute's broad language, they suggested that it was being used beyond its intended scope when applied to business disputes where no clear victims existed. The court also expressed concern about the precedent that would be set if such penalties were allowed to stand. They worried about the chilling effect on business activity in New York if companies could face massive civil penalties for valuation disputes that didn't result in actual harm to any identifiable parties. While the appeals court's decision to throw out the monetary penalty was a major victory for the Trump Organization, significant challenges remain. The multi-year ban preventing Donald Trump and his sons from holding corporate leadership positions in New York was not addressed in this ruling, leaving that punishment in place for now. This leadership ban represents a different type of legal challenge with its own constitutional and practical implications. Unlike monetary penalties, which can be evaluated based on their relationship to actual damages, operational restrictions raise questions about due process, the right to engage in lawful business activities, and the appropriate scope of civil enforcement. The ban effectively prevents the Trumps from serving as officers or directors of any New York corporation, not just the Trump Organization. This broad scope raises questions about whether such restrictions can be imposed based on civil findings rather than criminal convictions. From a constitutional perspective, the ban implicates several fundamental rights. The Due Process Clause protects individuals' liberty interests, including the right to pursue lawful occupations. Courts have traditionally required clear and convincing evidence of ongoing harm or likelihood of future misconduct before imposing such restrictions in civil cases. The Equal Protection Clause also comes into play, as critics argue that the Trump Organization is being treated differently from other companies that have faced similar allegations. They point to other high-profile cases where valuations were disputed but where such severe operational restrictions were not imposed. From a practical standpoint, the leadership ban creates complex questions about corporate governance and business operations. The Trump Organization is a large, complex enterprise with operations in multiple states and countries. Preventing its key leaders from holding official positions while allowing them to remain owners creates an awkward legal and operational structure. The ban also raises questions about its effectiveness as a remedial measure. If the goal is to prevent future misconduct, critics argue that ongoing monitoring and compliance requirements would be more effective than blanket prohibitions on leadership roles. Following the appeals court victory on the monetary penalty, Trump's legal team has announced their intention to challenge the remaining punishments before New York's highest court. This strategy reflects both confidence from their recent victory and recognition that the leadership bans represent a different but equally significant legal challenge. The decision to appeal to New York's Court of Appeals, the state's highest court, demonstrates the legal team's commitment to challenging what they view as prosecutorial overreach. They're arguing that the leadership bans, like the monetary penalty, exceed the appropriate scope of civil enforcement and violate constitutional protections. Their legal strategy focuses on several key arguments that have already proven successful in challenging the monetary penalty. First, they're arguing that the bans are punitive rather than remedial, making them inappropriate for civil enforcement actions. Second, they're challenging the bans as violations of due process rights. They argue that preventing individuals from engaging in lawful business activities based on civil findings, rather than criminal convictions, violates fundamental constitutional protections. The legal team is also making a broader argument about the precedent that would be set if such bans were allowed to stand. They contend that allowing attorney generals to impose criminal-like punishments in civil proceedings would fundamentally alter the balance between government power and individual rights. Their strategy also includes highlighting the lack of ongoing harm or misconduct that would typically justify such operational restrictions. They argue that the alleged conduct occurred in the past, that all financial obligations were met, and that there's no evidence of continued wrongdoing that would warrant ongoing restrictions. The legal team is likely to emphasize the appeals court's reasoning in overturning the monetary penalty, arguing that the same constitutional and legal principles that made the financial punishment excessive also make the leadership bans inappropriate. Attorney General Letitia James has made it clear that she's not backing down from this legal battle. Her office has announced plans to appeal the decision throwing out the monetary penalty, setting up what could be a prolonged legal battle that may ultimately reach federal courts. James's response reflects both the political and legal stakes involved in this case. From a political perspective, the case has been a centerpiece of her efforts to hold the Trump Organization accountable for alleged misconduct. The appeals court decision represents a significant setback that undermines the narrative of comprehensive victory that her office had promoted. From a legal perspective, James's office is arguing that the appeals court misunderstood both the facts of the case and the applicable law. They contend that the monetary penalty was appropriate given the scope and duration of the alleged misconduct, regardless of whether specific financial institutions claimed direct harm. The Attorney General's office is likely to argue that the appeals court took too narrow a view of harm in civil enforcement cases. They may contend that the integrity of New York's financial markets was harmed by the alleged misconduct, even if individual institutions weren't directly damaged. James's office is also likely to argue that Executive Law Section 63(12) was specifically designed to give the Attorney General broad powers to combat business fraud, and that the appeals court's decision undermines the statute's effectiveness in protecting consumers and markets. The decision to continue fighting, despite the appeals court setback, demonstrates the high stakes that both sides perceive in this case. For the Attorney General, allowing the appeals court decision to stand could significantly limit her office's ability to pursue similar cases in the future. The Attorney General's office may also be concerned about the precedent that would be set if businesses could avoid civil penalties by arguing that no specific parties were harmed, even in cases involving alleged systematic misrepresentation of financial information. The implications of this legal battle extend far beyond the Trump Organization and reach into fundamental questions about business regulation, prosecutorial power, and constitutional protections in civil enforcement cases. From a business perspective, the case has created significant uncertainty about the boundaries of civil enforcement in New York. Business leaders are watching closely to understand what conduct might trigger similar prosecutorial actions and what penalties might be imposed. The appeals court decision provides some clarity by establishing that monetary penalties must be related to actual harm and cannot be grossly disproportionate to any damages caused. This principle could significantly limit the Attorney General's ability to impose massive penalties in cases where no clear victims exist. However, the ongoing challenge to the leadership bans means that questions remain about what operational restrictions can be imposed in civil cases. The resolution of this issue could have significant implications for how businesses operate and how corporate governance disputes are resolved. From a legal precedent standpoint, the case is testing the boundaries between civil and criminal enforcement. The appeals court's decision suggests that civil proceedings cannot be used to impose criminal-like punishments without the procedural protections that accompany criminal cases. This principle could have broad implications for other types of civil enforcement actions, potentially limiting the ability of government agencies to impose severe penalties without clear evidence of ongoing harm or misconduct. The case is also highlighting tensions between state and federal authority in business regulation. While states have broad powers to regulate businesses within their borders, those powers are limited by federal constitutional protections. The constitutional questions raised by this case, particularly regarding due process, equal protection, and excessive fines, could ultimately require federal court intervention to resolve conflicts between state enforcement powers and constitutional rights. While this is officially a civil business case, the political implications cannot be ignored, especially as the 2024 election approaches. The appeals court victory provides Donald Trump with a significant talking point about prosecutorial overreach and the politicization of the legal system. The timing of these legal developments, coming during primary season and the lead-up to the general election, adds another layer of complexity to an already complicated case. Trump and his supporters are likely to point to the appeals court decision as evidence that the original charges were politically motivated rather than legally justified. However, the ongoing challenges to the leadership bans mean that legal uncertainties remain. The resolution of these issues could influence both Trump's business operations and his political messaging as the election approaches. For voters, this case raises broader questions about the role of legal challenges in political campaigns and the appropriate boundaries between civil enforcement and political combat. The appeals court decision suggests that courts are willing to check prosecutorial power when it exceeds legal boundaries, regardless of the political implications. The case also highlights the importance of an independent judiciary in protecting constitutional rights, even in high-profile political cases. The appeals court's willingness to overturn a lower court decision that had received significant media attention demonstrates the legal system's capacity for self-correction. As this legal battle continues, it will serve as a test of American legal institutions and their ability to maintain the rule of law while navigating intense political pressures. The ultimate resolution will likely influence how similar cases are handled in the future and may reshape the landscape of civil business enforcement. The question remains, will New York's highest court uphold the appeals court decision and further limit the Attorney General's enforcement powers, or will they restore some or all of the original penalties? The answer could determine not just the future of the Trump Organization, but the balance between government power and constitutional protections in civil enforcement cases nationwide. Whatever the outcome, this case has already demonstrated that even in highly politicized legal battles, constitutional principles and established legal precedent can still prevail over prosecutorial ambition and public pressure.